Welcome back to the Great and Spacious Building. I'm your host, Dr. Wayne Denton. Today, we're going to take a look at the presidency of David O. McKay, specifically through the lens of the priesthood ban. And throughout this episode, I hope to illuminate the manner in which David O. McKay is sort of a difficult read. There's many contradictory things going on during his presidency, and his presidency leaves us with a lot of questions. Specifically, the question that I'm going to use to guide this episode is going to be, why didn't David O. McKay end the priesthood ban during his presidency? So we're going to jump back. David O. McKay, he's going to become the president of the church in 1951 following the death of George Elbert Smith. But we're going to jump back 2 years before he actually becomes the prophet, specifically to August 17th, 1949. On this date, the First Presidency is going to release a statement regarding the priesthood ban. Connecting this to our last episode where we discussed Lowry Nelson and his back and forth with the First Presidency, what we're going to see here is the First Presidency responding to the push from individuals like Lowry Nelson. And we're going to see the priesthood ban set in stone as a doctrine from what I'm about to read. Usually, I just read snippets of these primary sources, but for this episode, I think it's important that I read the entire thing. So, August 17th, 1949, the attitude of the church with reference to Negroes remains as it has always stood. It is not a matter of the declaration of a policy, but of direct commandment from the Lord, on which is founded the doctrine of the church from the days of its organization, to the effect that Negroes may become members of the church, but that they are not entitled to the priesthood at the present time. The prophets of the Lord have made several statements as to the operation of the principle. President Brigham Young said, "Why are so many of the inhabitants of the earth cursed with a skin of blackness? It comes in consequence of their fathers rejecting the power of the holy priesthood and the law of God. They will go down to death, and when all the rest of the children have received their blessings in the holy priesthood, then that curse will be removed from the seed of Cain, and they will then come up and possess the priesthood and receive all the blessings which we now are entitled to." President Wilford Woodruff made the following statement: "The day will come when all that race will be redeemed and possess all the blessings which we now have. The position of the church regarding the Negro may be understood when another doctrine of the church is kept in mind, namely, that the conduct of spirits in the premortal existence has some determining effect upon the conditions and circumstances under which these spirits take on mortality, and that while the details of this principle have not been made known, the mortality is a privilege that is given to those who maintain their first estate, and that the worth of the privilege is so great that spirits are willing to come to earth and take on bodies no matter what the handicap may be as to the kind of bodies they are to secure, and that among the handicaps, failure of the right to enjoy in mortality the blessings of the priesthood is a handicap which spirits are willing to assume in order that they might come to earth. Under this principle, there is no injustice whatsoever involved in this deprivation as to the holding of the priesthood by the Negroes." Signed, the First Presidency. And that would be George Elbert Smith, J. Reuben Clark, and David O. McKay as second counselor. So in 1949, David O. McKay is going to sign on to this official statement supporting the priesthood ban as doctrine for the church. This is an interesting place to start as we delve into the personal feelings of David O. McKay versus David O. McKay acting in his position as a church leader and eventually president of the church. So let's get into this today. So David O. McKay and his feelings about the ban. His personal statements, many of his personal statements, and if you ever want to go read some of the David O. McKay papers, they are stored at the University of Utah, and they're accessible by researchers at the library. And David O. McKay, many of his papers, they indicate that he's uncomfortable with the priesthood ban and the rationale that has been given theologically by church leaders prior to his ascension to the actual prophethood here. So policy versus doctrine, that's going to be the first place that we're going to start here. And David O. McKay, obviously in 1949, as he's signing on to that first presidency statement, is adhering to the idea that this is doctrine. However, what we're going to end up seeing is that David O. McKay, he's going to have personal conversations, and one specific conversation is going to be with an individual named Sterling McMurrin. Sterling McMurrin is a member of the LDS Church, albeit a pretty liberal, progressive Mormon for the time. He's going to have a couple of run-ins with a few of the conservative members of Quorum of the 12 Apostles who are going to push for his actual excommunication due to some of his outward statements to the public about church doctrine and church policy. But Sterling McMurrin, he shares a respect for the church, and he respects David O. McKay in his new place as prophet, and he's actually going to have an opportunity to sit down with David O. McKay and discuss a few of his concerns with the church as a member and also as an academic. And the discussion eventually makes its way to the topic of the priesthood ban. And Sterling McMurrin just flat out says, and he had said this in speeches before, I don't see a doctrinal basis for this. And keep in mind, David O. McKay had signed on to this statement of doctrine in 1949. And interestingly enough, David O. McKay doesn't come back and say, well, have you read the 1949 statement? Instead, he says, I'm glad you say that because, and I quote, not now and never has there been a doctrine in this church that the Negroes are under a divine curse, end quote. In this meeting, so these are found in the Sterling McMurrin papers, and these can also be found at the University of Utah. And Sterling McMurrin, he records this discussion that he has with the prophet, and he's floored. And obviously with this, he's going to push, hey, if you're saying this is a policy, then why haven't we changed it? Or specifically, why haven't you in your new seat as prophet changed it? And McKay, he even goes further to say that this is the denial of the priesthood is a practice, I quote, practice, not a doctrine. And he alludes to what was in the 1949 doctrinal statement that someday it will be changed. He's obviously, and Sterling McMurrin records this, he's clearly uncomfortable when he's talking about this topic. And it's obvious when he also has to talk about it in public that he's uncomfortable with the rationale for this. And he really tries often in public to avoid the unpleasant feelings associated with this topic and really tries to stay off the grounds of discussing this in public. So David O. McKay, from this personal discussion with Sterling McMurrin, we get the background that he's not a strong supporter of this policy doctrine. One document that he signed on to says it's a doctrine, but in his personal discussions, he's saying this is a policy or a practice. So why did he have problems with it? One of his problems here was it was an impediment to growth for the church. And specifically when he's referring to this as an impediment for growth to the church, he's referring to the one drop rule. Again, the one drop rule, if you had one drop of African ancestry in your familial line, you were banned from receiving the priesthood. This goes even further to require prospective members and prospective priesthood holders to have to prove that they are pure white European ancestry. This one drop rule really calls on individuals to do that family history in order to prove their whiteness. And David L. McKay, in his own letters, writes that this is a serious impediment to church growth. And specifically, he's talking about places like South Africa and Brazil. Brazil's going to be an issue in the 1970s, but South Africa is going to be overseen by David O. McKay. He's actually going to make a visit to South Africa, and we're going to see how this one drop rule plays out for him. When he's visiting South Africa, he realizes that there are a lack of prospective priesthood holders in the South African mission. And what that means is there's a lack of potential leaders to lead church services and to conduct certain ordinances. And McKay ends up fearing that if the policy continued for another 25 or so years, the church wouldn't have enough men to carry on the work in these regions. Citing the lack of scriptural basis for this, he wants to make sure that this policy isn't based in scripture, and therefore he's going to pull together this informal group led by Apostle Lowell Benyon. And these individuals are going to research, well, what's the scriptural basis for A, the priesthood ban, but B, this one drop rule. And with this, what we end up seeing is there's not a scriptural basis for the one drop rule or the ban. Lowell Benyon comes back with his report that this is a mere policy and a practice. It's not based in doctrine. So following McKay's 1954 visit, he ends up making a change from the top. And McKay abolishes the one drop rule for the South African mission. He authorized the mission president to confer the priesthood if a man was worthy and had no outward evidence of a Negro strain, even if he couldn't trace his genealogy out of the country. So he takes the ownership of having to prove that one is pure white off of the prospective priesthood holder and puts the call in the hands of the priesthood holders themselves and says, hey, do you think this person is black or do you think they're white? If they look white and you have no reason to suspect otherwise, give them the priesthood. McKay is going to keep this under wraps. He's extremely proud of this action, as can be seen in his journal entries, and he believed that this action of removing the one drop policy in the South Africa mission could modify the church's attitude towards, as he phrases it, the colored people in the Union of South Africa, and would also in the future apply to Brazil. So he's thinking ahead, not just in South Africa, but a new place like a missionary hotbed like Brazil. But he urges subordinates around him in that South African mission to not proclaim this ruling or to give it too much publicity. He doesn't want people knowing that he had a say whole cloth himself in removing this one drop policy. He even continues to tell the public-facing Deseret News that the color line was strictly drawn. He's telling individuals that, yeah, the policies from Brigham Young until now are the same. And it's actually not that much of a problem. So what he's telling the public in media such as the Deseret News is contradictory to what he is doing behind the scenes in a place like South Africa. So as the prophet, he has the ability to change this policy and this practice of something like the one drop rule. So the question remains, why can he not, if Lowell Benyon and others, including Sterling McMurrin, an academic who has studied Mormonism, and David O. McKay himself, if they all place this as a policy and a practice, sort of just a tradition of sorts, why then can he not change the entire priesthood ban? Or a better question, why would he not change the priesthood ban? With this, David O. McKay, like every individual before him, it's not black and white. It's not, oh, he's the most racially progressive man. He ended the one drop rule in South Africa. He's pushing the church forward. We should look at him as all good. He's also not all bad. So David O. McKay, like every historical figure we've looked at, he is a gray figure. There are a couple of reasons that we can gather from David O. McKay's journals of why he stopped short of actually ending the priesthood ban itself. There are really two powerful reasons that he states multiple times throughout his records. The first one is going to be the fear of intermarriage. This is McKay's single biggest personal obstacle. So while he may believe that there are worthy black members who should be holding the priesthood, he is absolutely scared of this aspect of miscegenation or intermarriage. He was convinced that lifting the ban, and this comes directly from his records, that lifting the ban would lead to integration and intermarriage. For him, intermarriage, and again, I quote, bothers me more than anything. And he also declares, I quote, I don't believe in it. So there's this personal resistance to the idea of intermarriage, blacks mixing with whites for whatever reason here. And he doesn't express what the reason is, but he does express that he has a disagreement with the idea of intermarriage between races. So this is going to be the first issue that's really holding David O. McKay up. The second one is going to be just the institution itself. There is this idea that even if we look back at Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young made change from the top. These were two very charismatic individuals. Joseph Smith, on a whim, would give a prayer, receive some sort of revelation, or an idea would come into his mind, however you decide to phrase that. And Joseph Smith would make that church doctrine. He would profess that, yeah, this is the new direction the church has to go in. Changes came. It was a wild time. Brigham Young, same thing. After the death of these two leaders, these two early influential leaders, Joseph Smith, the foundational leader, Brigham Young, the stabilizing leader, what we start to see is the prophet's role as a charismatic leader is going to start to be reeled in little by little. And we're going to see the prophet look to his counselors in the first presidency, but also the entire quorum of the 12, or we get what we call the quorum of the 15. The prophet is two counselors and the 12 members of the quorum. They're going to seek consensus in their decision making. And with that, in any room that you're in, getting 15 men to agree on anything is extremely difficult. David O. McKay is also an individual that really likes to stay clear of confrontation, and that's really to his detriment in terms of ending the priesthood ban and the possibility of that. Part of it is there are many large personalities, strong personalities in the quorum of the 12 at this time. He's quoted as saying that he loathed to clash with fellow general authorities. And with that, this clash would be, it had to happen if there was going to be a change, because there were members in the Quorum of the 12 who vigorously supported the ban, such as Joseph Fielding Smith, who had come up with explanations for why the ban was there earlier. We had talked about him. Harold B. Lee is going to be a supporter of the ban. Mark E. Peterson going to be a supporter of the ban. These men were rooted into the position that the ban was doctrine and therefore must be part of the church teachings. Despite his own committee that he had formed with Lowell Benyon overseeing the study in this, he concluded that the change would require a revelation from the Lord. And he pled with the Lord without result. So David O. McKay is going to say that despite this being classified by multiple individuals as a policy or a cultural practice, I still need God in my prayers as prophet to reach out and say, hey, Brother McKay, Prophet McKay, you are okay to end this ban. And you can teach that to the other members of your quorum. And he writes about this struggle that he has in his personal life with prayer of God, waiting for God and asking God to give him an answer, but he doesn't receive that answer. And this is just an interesting contradiction. If we look back at the one drop rule, he was willing to use personal impressions and personal opinion to abolish the one drop rule. He did not ask his counselors. He did not require the Quorum of the 12 to take a vote that ended in consensus, but he used his own personal impressions to make a decision about South Africa. But he requires a formal institutional revelation to eliminate the ban entirely. This, for me, suggests that he has a personal prejudice, specifically that personal prejudice on intermarriage, that this personal prejudice overruled his administrative and ethical inclinations as he held them towards the idea of church growth. The church growing was more important than seeing individuals of all race be treated equally in the eyes of God. So the real thing that you can pull out there is that he has noted that he is truly fearful and not in favor of intermarriage, and he fears ending the ban will lead to intermarriage. So that intermarriage idea is getting in his way, as it has leaders of the church in the past. Remember, if we think all the way back to Brigham Young and his implementation of the ban, it came largely from fears of miscegenation, specifically back in the East Coast, with those members of the church that had already received the priesthood from the time of Joseph Smith. So, how do we look at David O. McKay? Myself, as a historian, again, I see him as a gray individual. His personal thoughts are this is wrong, but he also has an internal compass which is leading him toward the prejudice of wanting to prevent the possibility of intermarriage. And that gets in the way of ending the ban earlier than it was, which it will be in 1978. So this is really, for me, a lost opportunity. David O. McKay, as a leader who saw the ban as a policy without scriptural basis, he was sensitive to what he termed as the Negro problem, and he modified things such as the one-drop rule that had been in place since the time of Brigham Young, was ultimately paralyzed by his own fear of racial integration and dissent of powerful colleagues. He wasn't willing to address his own prejudice And he also wasn't willing to have the debates and the tough conversations that would need to happen. And it's really important to note that David O. McKay, he is, when he becomes prophet, he's an old man. He's in his 80s. And as this issue goes on longer, he's getting older and older and older and older. And as your body starts to wear down, the idea of having a conversation and an argument with other men that's maybe younger than you, maybe a little bit more full of life than you, that is a tiring issue. So maybe we can point to his age. I definitely think we can point to his prejudice, but largely it's a missed opportunity. What's the cost of this? His efforts to represent a lost opportunity. The church could have been in a greater harmony with larger American society and avoided all the negative publicity that it faces in the 1960s and eventually the 1970s. There's going to be a plethora of issues that we'll talk about in more depth, such as BYU being protested. The church is going to face media backlash left and right during the midst of the civil rights movement. Had David O. McKay taken the steps in the 1950s, the church is probably at a point where they're racially ahead of the game. Keep in mind, 1954, you have Brown versus Board of Education. Schools are being desegregated. After that, the Little Rock Nine, other schools, segregation's going to be outlawed in other arenas of life, not just education, following the Brown decision. If the church makes the decision on the priesthood ban around between 1951 and 1954, they're ahead of Brown versus Board of Education. If they make it in the 1950s, they're ahead of the civil rights legislations that are going to pass in the 60s. They're probably viewed in a light much different than they are today. They may actually be viewed as racially progressive, while other churches that waited, evangelical faiths, would be seen as racially regressive. So the church had an opportunity to cement itself in a spot where society could have looked at them as the beacon for what religion should do. But because David O. McKay misses the call, and this is a missed opportunity, it's going to be pushed out to 1978. So just my closing thoughts here. The contradictions of 1954 demonstrate the idea that institutional change is often less about clear revelation and more about the convergence of human conscience and our biases and our prejudice. So to take the human factor out of a prophet's life is doing that prophet's injustice. There is this need for agreement at the top. Consensus has been what has been sought for church change in the 20th century, in the 21st century. And that's really difficult when you bring the bias of 15 different men from a period that was much more conservative than the periods that we live in today. At any given point, we have men that are 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years old leading the church, oftentimes representing the generations that aren't really leading society that's much anymore. So oftentimes they're culturally out of step with the individuals that are actually making up the bulk of their membership. I think we really see that here with this missed opportunity to end the ban, possibly in the 1950s. So if you like what you saw today, please subscribe, like this video, tune in for future videos. And don't forget, starting in December on Wednesdays, we're going to be having a comparative book study, 2 different biographies of Joseph Smith. We're going to look at John Turner's biography of Joseph Smith that has just been released this year, and we're going to compare it up against Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History. So tune in for that when we get into December. We're going to continue with this series on race in the priesthood. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at some of the challenges faced by the LDS Church because of the missed opportunity that we talked about today. And eventually we're going to get to the end of the ban, and we'll probably have a couple episodes after that to see how the end of the ban has actually impacted the LDS Church into the 21st century where we are today. So once again, thank you for tuning in today, and have a great day.